Have you ever felt like some fictional aspect of your life has begun following, haunting, or tormenting your actual life?
I have sort of a weird answer to this question, and it's a bit of a long story. I'll do my best to try to summarize it succinctly. But I've prank called like a radio show slash podcast for God, like 5 6 years. Basically, it boils down to I've got e-cigarettes for legs. I'll tell like a roundabout story that'll culminate in either I've got e-cigarettes for legs, someone in the movie I was watching had e-cigarettes for legs, I ran into a guy with e-cigarettes for legs, some celebrity turned out to have e-cigarettes for legs, etc. And that's taken on kind of a life of its own in a lot of frustrating ways. Vulture, I don't know if they still do this, but for a long time would do kind of podcast roundups every week, and the host of this podcast, quote unquote, caught the e-cigarette for legs guy back in, I want to say like 2019, and Vulture wrote that up in their roundup. And that to me felt like I was being haunted by like a fictional creation. Like, people had taken up the mantle and were, dragging my name through the muck, so to speak. I felt like, like in Batman movies when like people are pretending to be Batman and they're wearing like, I'm not wearing hockey pants or whatever he says. Like it felt like that, people were wearing e-cigarettes for legs and hockey pants.
And so does it still haunt you to this day, or is the trauma in the past?
I called in fairly recently and they told me they could track my phone number now. So I'm now too afraid to call it. Yeah, I mean, it haunts me, of course. Not in like a nightmare sense, more in like I could have monetized this. I think it really haunts my dad. I think he really was expecting I would monetize the character. When I told him some guy was like selling merch, he literally like shed a tear.
Well, Frankie, can you top that?
Do you have any fictional characters who've become like wayward children? Or
I don't have anything that really compares to that. I do have a very bizarre story where, for the course on mad criminals that I teach, I had my students do a final project where I used to make them do a actual film, but for this year I just had them do a script where they do their own mad criminals movie that they make it. They decided to make the serial killer in that movie be a college professor who teaches courses about mad criminals and abducts his female students and locks them in a basement under the pretense of helping them study. So once I saw that for their final project, I was a little troubled by teaching this class, but that was 2 years ago that happened, and it still hasn't stopped me, but it still does haunt me that this is what why students think I'm teaching the class.
Welcome once again to Split Picks. It's October. We are dutifully assembled in the Split Tooth compound. Last week, we spent 2 episodes looking at the films of Dario Argento to kick off our special series on the Italian horror greats. Bennett, you took us on a tour of the caves of the Phantom of the Opera, and Steve Collins pulled us into some paintings to talk about the Stendhal syndrome. Both were really fun episodes, but we are here because we are talking about the Italian Godfather of Gore, Mr. Lucio Fulci. We once again have Bennett Glace back. Are you ready for some more gore today, Bennett?
Oh yeah, you can say that again.
Are you ready for some more gore today, Bennett?
You can ask that again. Yeah, I certainly am.
And also joining us, we have Dr. Frankie Vanaria. Frankie, it's been a while. Welcome back. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me back. I love the opportunity to do this with you and with Bennett especially. This seemed like a very Bennett kind of idea for a project, so I'm looking forward to it.
This is your first episode together. I'm excited to see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So before we fully dive in, Frankie, can you give us a brief introduction to the film you chose today and a bit about what stands out to you about it?
Sure. So the movie that I chose is The House by the Cemetery by Fulci and He made it in 1981. It's a strange movie. Like a lot of other Fulci movies, there are parts of it that simply don't make sense, or they have a kind of logic that is, there are scenes that have a kind of impenetrable logic. There are things that Fulci brings up, things that happen to characters or get referenced with characters that are never picked up again in the movie, and you have to figure out why was that told to us, because it doesn't ever seem significant enough to be a red herring or anything. It's just told and then dropped. The film is about a family who moves from New York to a small town in Massachusetts, which is where I'm not from the town, but I'm from Massachusetts, so it's nice to see that. It's a kind of typical haunted house story, possession story in a way, with, as you would imagine, father, mother, and son move into this house, and all kinds of hijinks ensue with all of the blood and gore and kind of fantastical violence that you would want from a Fulci movie.
And quite a spooky son.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Bob, but I swear to God, the most terrifying thing in the movie is that horrible, horrible child.
All right, Ben, and what film are you going to have us look at today?
Yeah, and I picked a slightly later film from Fulci, 1990's A Cat in the Brain, which I think a lot of people regard as his final major film. This is a metatextual work from Lucio Fulci. A lot of people have compared it to Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I heard in a podcast that he apparently threatened litigation against Wes Craven over New Nightmare. And they are similar in a lot of respects. I mean, it's a fundamentally similar premise, but it's not as if a character from Fulci's films is coming back to haunt him. Fulci plays himself, or a version of himself, Dr. Fulci, a filmmaker who is having a tough time separating fact from fiction, is being haunted by images of gore and goop and grim murder. And apparently these are all edited. Some of them are edited in from actual films of his, and some of these are from sort of cut rate thrillers that he put his name on, like Lucio Fulci Presents type titles. And his psychiatrist is secretly murdering people and trying to frame him for it. That's sort of the B plot. And it's a different sort of style of shooting in the murders than you're used to seeing in a giallo. It's kind of like a blend of what we're used to seeing in Italian horror movies and what we're used to seeing in kind of regional American horror movies. We were talking about it off mic. A lot of people really don't seem to like this movie. It has kind of a piss poor reputation. A lot of people think the central gimmick doesn't work. You kind of get it once the first hallucination happens. But I don't know. I thought this has a really wonderful tone. The sort of dreamlike logic that you come to expect from Fulci's films is used to really wonderful effect. And I don't know. I just like it when directors act.
Yeah. We've covered a few of those on this show with you, so yeah, I think these are both really fun movies, and I think show his range is covered pretty well here. And so just as a reminder, just like the last episodes, this is not a career-spanning look at Lucio Fulci. I don't know if combined we've seen even half of his films because he's made so many of them, but we're looking at these two as a snapshot of his career to see what these films tell us about his overall body of work. We'll get going. So Fulci's film career began as a screenwriter for comedies in the 1950s. He also began directing comedies before jumping into the world of giallo, where he made his name as the Italian Godfather of Gore. Give me your general take on Fulci as a director, what makes him worth discussing, and a few of his films you'd point people to start with, maybe.
So I think what makes Fulci interesting is that, I would sort of describe it as him having almost a preservationist kind of aesthetic with the way that he represents horror. And there are certainly moments with particularly gory scenes, as you would expect from the genre, that feel gratuitous, that feel excessive, but they feel that they almost have a kind of scientific or genuine interest in examining, well, what happens to a human being when they kind of make that transition from being alive to being dead, or from looking or feeling human to not being that anymore. And, that takes on a lot of shapes and a lot of mutilations of different parts of the body and psyche and spirit in Fulci's movies. But for me, what I think is really fascinating about him is that there is that kind of bent in his films to some degree towards cruelty, towards violence, towards kind of the spectacle of pain and suffering, but always with a kind of interest in what is the human dimension that kind of gets lost in seeing this kind of pain. So yeah, I think for me, that's kind of why his films stand out. I think, Cat in the Brain is a great kind of companion for House by the Cemetery because he's playing himself. He's taking that kind of reflexive approach and kind of thinking about what that actually preserving himself in a way as a kind of artist making this type of aesthetic.
What about a few standout films?
When I really started prepping for this, I kind of watched a bunch of Fulci movies together. So a lot of them just meld into the same thing. So I do want to say that I like Manhattan Baby, but I kind of just want to say that I like it because I want to be able to have an edge against Rosemary's Baby, even though I also like Rosemary's Baby. I really do. I enjoy The Beyond. I enjoy, the sort of the Gates of Hell trilogy in general. But yeah, it's definitely House by the Cemetery is the one that I have the most kind of affection for.
Bennett, how about you?
So I want to apologize out of the gate for something I'm probably going to do, which is like unnecessarily always refer to Fulci kind of in relation to Argento. I feel like there is sort of there's a Keaton Chaplin sort of thing with the two of them. They're very oftentimes, and it's pretty reductive, honestly, to think of them in terms of each other. I always pit them against one another. Nevertheless, I'm going to do that quite a lot. Argento in his later films, including the two that we watched for our pair of Argento episodes, really puts you in this really truly bananas headspace, finds this incomparable mix of tones. I think the Stendhal Syndrome is a really great example of where that works. I like Dracula 3D, a movie that a lot of people don't like from him. And that's a movie that features a bunch of characters getting attacked by a CGI praying mantis. Now, that's the sort of move that only a supremely confident director who is firmly entrenched in kind of the late style period of their career would deal in. Fulci gives you something like that in his first horror film, A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, a film about my ex-wife. Sorry, I had to do it. I'm sorry. You can cut that out. But that film features our heroine being chased in this sort of dreamscape by an enormous like bird puppet that we also see in like a crazy silhouette. Even the early Fulci films have what we would think of as being kind of like late style signifiers from his genre and his countrymen and his sort of genre compatriots. And I like that about him. I think the things that are working and the things that aren't working are always really very, very intimately connected in his films. I think of, Argento as being a director of sequences. The Hitchcock influence, he really wears it on his sleeve. His command of the camera is very expert. You can really tell you're in the hands of a master. Whereas Fulci is, a director of images. He really, really can craft some incredibly repulsive stuff. And again, like Argento, he's tuned into a lot of like the little pains. There's that eye gouging that's famous in Zombie that really lets you linger on what it would really be like to be stabbed through the eye. And we've talked about where Argento has moments like that, the many of them having to deal with eyes, but Fulci is uniquely interested in like what it looks like when the body like falls apart. And, I saw The Beyond back in 2017, apropos of nothing, and immediately knew it was a movie I was going to remember for the rest of my life. I would put him in the same ballpark as somebody like Tobe Hooper, who obviously has sort of an inconsistent career, was not always working with like the most resources, certainly was underestimated by a lot of people, but I can't think of like an uncompelling movie from him. Of the 14 I've seen, I think Demonia is kind of boring, but even that has a scene where a woman is like covered in slugs. So you really can't go wrong. And he's also one of the directors where if you go on Tubi and look up Lucio Fulci, there's like 10 movies of his on Tubi. So I mean, it's like walking into a video store and they've got a freaking Fulci section, folks. But
what about Ben? What are a few of your favorites, just to get those out in the ether?
Yeah. Other than A Cat in the Brain, City of the Living Dead is incredible. You've maybe seen the GIF of a woman throwing up all of her organs. It's
So great.
that. So my description of it: a woman throwing up all of her organs. Imagine that like times 10. It really is a woman throwing up all of her organs. Like you're watching it for like 3 minutes. You're like, oh well, there's a liver. The Beyond, of course, Manhattan Baby. I'll echo that. New York Ripper is a movie that I don't think I would ever watch again, but quite good. Though it definitely some violence that I'm not in a hurry to watch again. I watched The Devil's Honey, one of his sort of not quite horror movies, a psychological psychosexual thriller. Fellas, don't let Anthony Lane see this one. Holy moly, this movie is horny. Oh, good lord. And I'm not talking about the saxophone. And then Don't Torture a Duckling is a great one that I think is a little more psychological, a little more high-minded. There's a little bit of like, there's critique of like the Catholic Church going on. We'll obviously compare him a little bit to Wes Craven when we're talking about Cat in the Brain being like New Nightmare. I think Don't Torture a Duckling finds him in similar sort of psychological headspace as like Wes Craven at his best, exploring kind of generational trauma and this sort of toxic town where this abuse is going on. Yeah, you really can't go wrong, folks. Lucio Fulci.
All right. As always, we'll go chronologically, so that means The House by the Cemetery is up first. So as we've mentioned, it is the third installment of the Gates of Hell trilogy, which follows The City of the Living Dead and The Beyond. I was surprised. Going by the Italian release dates, all three of these movies came out within 368 days of each other. That's basically 3 movies in a year. That's wild, especially for how good all 3 of those are. Frankie, maybe you want to take a little time to talk about what the trilogy just as a whole is about.
Sure. So, yeah, the kind of conceit of the trilogy is that in the first entry of it, in City of the Living Dead, you have, as you might imagine from a trilogy that has this name, you have the gates of hell that are opened up by a priest. And essentially, what follows in the film is kind of watching people turn into basically zombies throughout the rest of the movie, and as they're kind of moving towards the open gate and kind of like I'll say the beyond, because even though that's kind of misleading, I guess it's relevant for the second film, but essentially it's opening up an entry point to some other kind of demonic netherworld space, and there's this kind of like religious component to it, this kind of dark magic component to it, but not especially pronounced. It's kind of just thrown out there and just, okay, priest did this, and here are the results from that. The Beyond is following up on essentially just the conceit of the first movie, not to trivialize the first one. I think I like the Beyond a little bit more, but of course, as Bennett brought up, in City of the Living Dead, the woman who loses all of the organs, it's a great moment. It seems to go on forever, and you never realize what is inside of a human being until it shows you all of that. I think the Beyond I like a little bit more, just because I think I have more of an affection for this kind of the haunted house genre as a concept. And this is slightly, it's not quite the same. It's a haunted hotel, but it's basically a woman who inherits a defunct hotel that is kind of enchanted by this kind of dark magic. And it also has spirits of the damned coming through it, and the woman's responsibility is to turn this into a profitable, or thinks that she might turn this into a kind of profitable business for herself. But it is an excellent kind of example of like the Southern Gothic tradition, and kind of working through that. While it's cursed, it has my favorite probably of the Fulci that I've seen. The spider sequence is, of course, everybody loves that one. I love the vomiting up our organs, but as someone who's afraid of spiders, it was really moving to see somebody's face torn off in ways that don't look or sound at all like what you would imagine that to look or sound like, and that it is also something that lasts for, it seems like, 8 minutes.
He really relishes the death scenes.
It almost goes back in time and reconstructs his face just to
Yeah.
deconstruct it.
There's another scene in the Beyond. I cannot explain how we get here with these characters or who these characters are, but that girl sees her mom's like head get like acid dumped on it, and she's like, they keep cutting back to her looking at her face like melting
in the hospital.
What's so crazy about Fulci's movies is very rarely do characters like scream as they're getting like eaten alive or like their throats being bitten out or they're melting. It's always this weird like placid acceptance of death. Same with like characters watching like characters getting melted. It's very unusual, and it adds to the like uncanny nature of everything.
Yeah. In his movies, it seems so much that you're just witnessing things happen and you're not able to like stop what's happening, whether you are the victim of the violence or you're seeing it done to somebody else.
So the titles may be pretty self-evident, but we have The House by the Cemetery taking place in the Gates of Hell trilogy. How does this one fit in?
So this one kind of fits in the loosest way possible because it doesn't really draw on the mythos that much that we might, such as it is. I mean, it's not the Marvel movies, so there's not like necessarily Easter eggs working their way through these movies. But House by the Cemetery, there is a character who lives in this house by the cemetery, hilarious name, Dr. Freudstein, who is, you know, the monster of the movie, who kills, maims anyone who enters the house. Freudstein was a doctor of some kind who got into some kind of illegal experiments that resulted in him being transformed into a monster who lives in the basement. So the family is tortured by him and just by this bizarre kind of cosmology where the house is possessed, and there are other characters who have psychic connections to each other. Bob, the demonic little Aryan child, somehow having a connection to the events that happen. Part of what makes it interesting, and this goes back to the idea of like bringing things up and never following through on them. One of the main characters, Norman, the kind of patriarchal figure, the reason that they come to the town is he is supposed to carry through on research that a colleague / friend / it seems like that there's some animosity between them though, based on how he talks about this guy Peterson or Dr. Peterson. Mm-hmm. He comes to this town supposedly to complete research for his colleague that requires that he move to New Whitby, which is the name of the town, and kind of live in this house for 6 months. When he does this though, there's at one point a character says to him, "Oh, well, you came here like last year or however many years ago to see Peterson. You were here with your daughter." And he says, "Well, I've never been here before. I have a son, and you know, I don't know what you're talking about." There are kind of moments like that where you have characters referring to things that happened or kind of vague associations that the main characters don't seem to be totally keyed in on or don't have any conscious awareness of, but it's always hinting that there's some kind of unconscious or kind of demonic or cosmic connections that characters become aware of too late.
Fulci is not shy from the first scene. I mean, my question after that first scene is just, how hard are our skulls really? I mean, he goes for it just right out of the gates.
Jeez, yeah. Not too many movies show you someone getting stabbed through the head, and Fulci goes there immediately here.
Through the back of the head and through your mouth.
Yeah.
As with a lot of movies we've discussed on this podcast, I think 5 minutes in if you're on this movie side or not.
Yeah, I mean, once you see someone getting stabbed and where the edge of the knife essentially becomes the person's tongue and they can't yell out because their body has been fused with a weapon, you're like, okay, I'm on board for this. But then it doesn't really pick up that aesthetic for the rest of the movie. I was expecting it to have more, like, that's such an iconic kind of slasher image, but the rest of the movie is not like that. The rest of the movie is like The Shining, essentially.
No, it's weird. Yeah, it's like it's very briefly a slasher, then it's like a ghost movie, and then it's toward the very end a gore movie.
Yeah.
Very, very briefly,
Yeah.
once the nature of the entity is revealed,
Mhm.
including some of his grosser images. I mean, the use of maggots here is really unbelievable, especially when you consider that like these have all got to be real maggots. Like it's not like they're using like animatronics.
So you've both kind of touched on this already, but one thing I do love about Fulci is how he just lets the fantastical exist. And it's a lot like how Argento uses the dream logic. You know, Frankie, you've mentioned there's the telepathic connection between the children. The whole town thinks they've seen Norman before, and then there's also a great scene where a mannequin is just beheaded in a storefront window. I mean, how do you feel this film establishes itself early on, and what do you make of the world it presents to us?
Yeah, I think the mannequin image is such a good one, and I love the way that works because this happens very early on in the movie. The mannequin that we see the young girl, May, who is kind of a ghost, a spirit, something.
Well, I guess we should back up because she's first seen in a photo in the family's apartment in New York.
So our introduction to May comes with Bob, the little boy, which it doesn't, just as a parenthetical, why would you ever name why would his name?
It is so weird that they call him Bob and not Bobby or Robbie.
Yes.
It's so weird to call a little kid Bob.
Just call him Robert. Bob is the name of
like Bob is like a guy who's like butt crack is sticking out.
It just doesn't make any sense. Why the kid looks the way that he does with that name, and at least for the version that I watched,
he's horrifically dubbed.
It's horrible.
Oh,
it's horrifying.
This is the shrillest movie ever made. That scene with the bat, I was like, oh my god, I have to turn this down.
It is incredible. But yeah, all of those are reasons why he is the most kind of fascinating and terrifying figure to me. But Bob sees May in this photograph in the family's New York apartment at the beginning, and May says to him, or as Bob tells his mother, she's saying, don't go, or, don't come to the house, essentially. And May is kind of this figure who does seem to want Bob to not go into the house, but does also want Bob to be a friend of some kind. So it's how much May knows about the kind of world that she's a part of. She tells Bob things about it, but she doesn't seem necessarily like a sinister figure exactly. So there's a sense that she is just a child and doesn't fully understand all of what's happening. So Bob and May seem to have this connection. May is kind of his guide. We see the mannequin scene. This was very bizarre to me, but May looks at a store mannequin, and it's kind of a jarring image for her, and she reacts in a way where she sees it being decapitated, and the way that it's done I love, because you hear it snap as you would hear like human bone snapping, and then the head just falls down essentially like a tower collapsing in on itself. So it is this weird combination of human sound on an inanimate object, but then it looks like a building falling down, and then you just kind of see the head fall. May sees that happen, and we later learn, as Fulci tells us in his very direct and didactic way, the mannequin is the figure who will become the babysitter for Bob while the family is at this cursed house. So I was just interested in her as how much does she and how much do other characters really know about themselves. And I was also interested by this angle. The film tries to set up a parallel between Peterson and Norman. So I think the idea is that Peterson was married and had a mistress, and that Freudstein kills his mistress. Fulci seems to want to make it seem like there is some sexual tension or some kind of source of jealousy, that Norman and Anne have something, or that there's a hint of something, and that Norman's wife, Lucy, is kind of upset by her intrusion in the family. I don't know if that was me reading too much into it, but it seems like it's another one of these instances in the film of characters kind of being trapped in relationships or in dynamics that they aren't fully worked out, but that kind of makes it more interesting without everything clearly explained to you.
I think all the relationships are kind of just supposed to be undefined, but you just know there's something below the surface that never really comes up. This film, like we've mentioned, kind of is bookended by some brutal moments and kills. What's the standout moment to you?
I think it's that stabbing through the head is the standout kill. Later on, there's some maggot stuff with what is that Freudstein's sort of like reanimated corpse that is pretty grim to me. But I don't think it tops the stabbing in the head. It's definitely, I like this one. It doesn't get toward the top tier of Fulci for me because it can't quite sustain that. I think also the presence of Bob throughout probably diminishes it in my eyes. I don't know. I'll give Fulci the benefit of the doubt. I like to say he knew what he was doing in kind of a character that would normally be easy for us to feel affectionate towards, that would normally be like an audience surrogate of a sort, and making them just completely unappealing.
So I do have to say, Brett and I found an interview with the actor who plays Bob as a man.
Has he addressed
he was
critical
like,
response to his performances?
He was just like, I'd like to say that's not my voice. It was dubbed, and I apologize because I know it's terrible.
It's weird that he's named Bob and the dubbing is horrific.
It's bad.
Because although his appearance is also
strange. It's a weird haircut.
It's a weird haircut. His teeth are too sharp. His eyes are too blue. His hair is too blonde. His lips are too red. He's, a terrifying little... But all of those things, to me, it gets to how strange children are, or the way that this movie presents them. Because, like Bob throughout the movie oscillates between being very hyper aware of things happening around him and also just not really giving a shit about anything.
It certainly creates like an eerie, all-encompassing sort of sense of horror that like their kid was possessed from the start.
Yeah.
There's that sense, like they never had a chance. There's been this cosmic design against them. I don't know that he never did like an actual Lovecraft adaptation, but he's oftentimes referred to, or he's oftentimes discussed in terms with reference to Lovecraft, and these films in particular, these Gates of Hell films, as being a capable kind of adaptation, not of Lovecraft's work, but of that tone. And I think there is a lot of that here. There's this sense that the menace is really kind of inescapable. And the fact that Anne is possessed, is someone who just like comes with the house, being good evidence of, how that manifests.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my favorite scene in this movie is, Frank, you just teased it, but Bob goes into the cellar and then he's locked in and he can't get out. I thought it was amazing, though, because in one of the bonus features, they were breaking down how they filmed that scene. And when the axe goes through the door right by Bob's head, that was real. That was an actual axe with Bob right there. And yeah, they actually shot that. I thought that was incredible. But in that scene, Frankie, in your notes, you mentioned that Fulci loves putting characters in situations where they're trapped and they cannot escape the evil that's just lurking. That scene stands out to me because it's like, well, he's just kind of trapped and like they're trying to break it down. But how do you feel this whole feeling of being trapped affects The House by the Cemetery?
Yeah, I think there are ways in which, like that scene that you're talking about, Craig, it's a very thrilling moment. And no, I did not know the tidbit of that being, they almost
wild.
Did head off with that.
You talk about things that couldn't be done today. That's at the top of the list.
Of all of the kills that we see, there's a moment where the woman who gives them the house, Mrs. Gittleson, is murdered. She is killed in a striking way. It has a little bit more consistency with a slasher aesthetic, but she's basically trapped in the floorboard or she twists her ankle or something. She can't get up. And this is when Dr. Freudstein, or his body, walks over to her, and he just kind of, you see looking at her that her chest is just like, her breasts are just like moving very much in front of frame and kind of just moving up and down. And you see her kind of gasping for her life as he's just slowly poking her with like a rod or something and just piercing her skin in different places before actually finishing her off. It was an image that I found compelling, but also quite disturbing, because you have this, as you would expect with a lot of slasher films, this sense of gore and sexualization going hand in hand, but not of a younger woman that you would normally see in this kind of genre, but of an older, not an elderly woman, but an approaching middle-aged woman. She's just kind of indifferent to the family's issues that they bring up with her and their kind of desire to move to a different house. She has a kind of vested interest in being able to preserve the integrity of the house. But her murder in particular, not because I found her like an especially sympathetic character or anything, but her real sense of helplessness and her incidental role within the movie. Like, she doesn't do anything that's really that important, and yet she's kind of met with this dark, divine, cosmic punishment. I think kind of speaks to the cruelty that exists in the world in Fulci's trilogy, certainly, and the kind of, no matter what you do, no matter what kind of functionary you are within this world, you still get punished for it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Whatever your role in the plot, whatever like stock function you're playing, if you're an old person, if you're a kid, if you're an animal, you're not spared in Fulci's films. Scanning through, the image for me actually that really sells the end of it, and is one of the grosser ones in his oeuvre, is when the father stabs Freudstein's corpse and that like disgusting goop full of maggots comes out. Oh, great image.
And the bat scene in the kitchen when it's just on his hand, just like, oh, I'll just keep stabbing it. Oh no, it won't die.
You wonder if like Fulci paid for all of these effects like out of his own pocket, these makeup effects, because he feels like he wants to get his money worth out of every single like gore effect. Yeah, everything's got to get its full moment in the sun.
Well, I think for the bat, they only had the one prop, so they're like, all right, do it right, or we have to like rebuild it. So let's do it.
I mean, the bat. I love the bat sequence just because it goes on for so long prior to him even trying to like cut the bat off. But also, I mean, Craig, you allude to this, but he's stabbing it so hard and so much that he would be stabbing through his hand. Yeah. And then he pulls, the bat comes off, and you look at his hand and it's bloody, but there's just like 2 fang marks there. It's like, dude, you would not have a hand anymore from what you yourself did to spoil yourself. But yeah, Bennett, I think that's another image that stands out to me, like when Freudstein gets stabbed, and it happens in this really fascinating and compelling way where when Norman does it, it's not like a heroic moment necessarily. He just kind of walks directly towards the camera.
No, it's almost like a childish, like, well, let's see what happens when I do this sort of a move. Yeah,
exactly. It felt like that was the best take of it that they had, and they couldn't like do a better one. So okay, this is not really what it's supposed to look like, but this is kind of what we have to settle for. And yeah, it has no urgency to it. You barely see him do the action at all, but the payoff for the action is this grotesque and really, difficult to watch image, as you're saying, of the maggots. It looks like maggots, but just kind of pouring out like him. But it also looks like just shit coming out.
It literally looks like shit. Yeah. It's grotesque, and I don't know, the whole family dynamic is so like off kilter in the movie. Like, it's fitting his weird like hesitance to like do this thing to protect his family, because like as they're down there and he's supposed to be protecting his wife, you get the sense throughout that both parents kind of feel the way about Bob that we do, especially in the beginning when she's like yelling at him about the picture. Like they don't respond to his like intimations of haunting with like healthy skepticism or like fear. They respond, at least she does in that sequence, with like a kind of a hostility, which makes sequences like that scene in the basement really I don't know, interestingly charged. It's like, it's not the same as like the similar sequence in like Signs, where there's a lot of you can really feel the affection. But actually, it is really similar to the sequence in Signs, because I think that's a movie where like Mel Gibson's character is really kind of like wrestling with how he feels about his family. Yeah, I don't know. Like Fulci is like incapable of doing anything at all conventional. Like he's incapable of making like a normal, depicting a normal relationship,
I know,
a normal family.
it's so strange though, because yeah, I think that's what's so fascinating about it. Because yeah, he is constitutionally incapable of doing this. Because you would imagine for this type of movie, it would begin with like perfect family, and a different director would do it. Perfect family, everything kind of works, and it kind of breaks down once the events of the house, in the house, kind of unfold. But Norman has barely a relationship with his wife. No, he has no like one-on-one scene with his son even in this movie. You get the sense that he's annoyed by him, or just is not capable of dealing with him at all, which is an interesting lens to kind of, I mean, the movie kind of begs that you see it this way, but reading Freudstein as kind of like a projection or a cipher for Bob is like, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense that he would want to kill his parents, who don't have any kind of capacity of kind of love or kind of understanding or empathy for him. That also is just interesting to go back to the why Bob has such a big role in the movie when he really can't do much of anything. And just the fact that what pours out of Freudstein when he's stabbed looks like shit. I think that's also, it gets to, if you asked Bob, what do you think human bodies are made of? He'd probably say, well, just like some mush and stuff, or it just, there's just shit inside of a body. I don't really get it. It kind of looks like what you would, if you were a kid, imagining what's the worst thing that you could see come out of somebody, or what's what you think is inside of a body. That's your answer.
I do think the basement scene does a good job of capturing what it would actually be like to have your fears realized. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had the feeling like, oh my God, there's someone in the house right now. And then you go upstairs, it's like, oh, there's no one, of course. But like, what if there actually was? Like, that's what I've always been scared of. Like, what if there were? Like, I think you just kind of freeze, and that's what all the characters do. And that's where Fulci really zooms in and lets the gore just kind of slowly drip,
Yeah, and it's cool to see somebody who is usually working on such a cosmic, otherworldly scale deal with something as relatable as like a staircase that you have to run up and that little hole you have to squeeze your way through. It's really him bringing it down to earth in a way that I don't think he often does. Having something so crazy and supernatural happening with something that we can all relate to. Like turning the basement lights off and like sprinting up the stairs. He really actually builds the geography of the house surprisingly well, I think, for a director who's not necessarily associated with coherence.
Yeah. I think my last question for House by the Cemetery is the concluding quote. So we're shown a quote by Henry James, and it says, "No one will ever know whether children are monsters or monsters are children." What do you think that does for the end of the film?
So it's interesting because one of the details that we haven't mentioned as much of about the film is that Freudstein, other than just like normal grunting and groans, like he does make a noise, and this is a pretty common Fulci trope of just like wailing, and in House by the Cemetery, wailing children, it seems, or a crying child. And at one point when Freudstein gets his hand cut off, he seems to be crying about that. Yet the movie is not really that sympathetic to him as a character. So I don't know that the quote is necessarily saying that there is some kind of humanity contained within like these monstrous figures, or such a monstrous figure. But I think it's kind of erring more on the side of, a little bit what I was talking about before in terms of the alien nature of children, and kind of the fact that they're not really they're not socialized in the way that normal human beings are. And there's a way, as we were talking about with our conversation of Bob's parents, they just don't know anything about their son on a very fundamental level, and don't really have an interest in knowing anyway. And it's just kind of a final thought. There's a moment where Bob says to May, parents just do what they want to do, and kids don't get to have any real say. in a sense, the film is kind of offering up the idea, well, what if you put yourself in the mindset of how a child sees or kind of interacts with these strange occurrences rather than from the perspective of the adult, and maybe that explains somewhat the kind of incomprehensibility of the plot or kind of how characters are relating. Perhaps that speaks to a non-human adult and either take that as monstrous or childlike way of understanding violence and kind of the events that unfold.
Can I ask a potentially stupid question? Is that quote real? Is that actually from a Henry James novel or short story, or did he just make it up? Is it like a veneer of... it is real?
I believe so, because I saw an interview with him where he said he was referencing Turn of the Screw. I'm not sure
because it would be super
not,
funny if it's just if it's just a fake quote. It's definitely reminiscent of Turn of the Screw, at least thematically.
Yeah.
I don't know. For me, it adds more kind of fuel to the fire for the whole question of like whether or not Bob is internet the whole time, and the nature of his sort of possession. We should talk a little bit about the ending. When Bob is saved from the basement, he is welcomed into the Freudstein family. He's like back in time, and is there
in the photo from their apartment too.
Yep. Yeah. And I don't know. What do you make of that ending? It's a little reminiscent of the ending of The Beyond. You know, you kind of enter into this weird like ghostly realm at the end, but it's as opposed to being kind of like a apocalyptic world, he is being welcomed into another like family. So it's, I don't know, it's like playing on this like elemental childhood fear, you know, being like separated from your family. But in a way, it's almost got this sort of bittersweet, nostalgic sort of tone to it again. Fulci refusing to do anything the way another director might.
I mean, it's interesting because I think you're right, Bennett, that it has this kind of bittersweet component where he does get a family. And I think his relationship with May would certainly be more like that's what he wants. That's a kind of companion that he wants. The older woman, is that supposed to be Mary Freudstein?
I think so.
That was my take, yeah.
That old woman has just a very haunting presence in the movie of constantly saying, okay, May, it's time to do this, it's time to do that. And Bob does I think Bob has a better relationship with his mother, even if she's not exactly like on the level that he really needs her to be. Like, of the two parents, she's the one who cares more about him. And it seems almost that he's getting May, but he's almost getting a more indifferent mother or grandmother figure. So there is this kind of sense that even in this afterlife that I guess that he has, he's still not going to be totally happy with what it is, even though he gets more of what he wants.
You kind of have to love the obvious symbolism of, you know, there's the gravestone in the kitchen that he's pulled through. It's like, come on, House by the Cemetery, you got to love it. Also, I got to give a shout out to the realtor. When she's leaving the house the first time, she runs over a gravestone, just goes, damn tombstone. I love that. Well, we should probably get moving on this. So any final thoughts on House by the Cemetery before we get to A Cat in the Brain?
Check it out, folks.
Yeah. Even though it's the third in the trilogy, I think you could pretty easily watch it first and not lose anything. I mean, in some ways, it's a better entry point than some of the other movies.
It's a good trilogy in the sense that it's, you know, loosely connected, unlike something like Saw.
Yeah, right. It's not quite like the Saw movies. But any fan of the Saw movies, I think, will find a lot to like in Lucio Fulci's work.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to be right back looking at Lucio Fulci's 1990 movie, A Cat in the Brain.
I swear to God, though, he pulls off a trick in the first 10 minutes that you would never in a million years.
Why would I never believe it in a million years? You don't think I could get why? I'm too stupid? I'm too stupid to understand what it would be?
He's wearing a pair of like NBA like warm-ups. He rips them off. He says Alakazam, he rips them off, and instead of legs, he's got two blue e-cigarettes.
Oh! He's got e-cigarettes instead of legs!
Bennett, I need your opinion on this Fulci quote from 1982. So he's doing a magazine interview, and they were discussing the effects of horror on audiences. and he was saying he thinks horror is harmless because audiences cheer when the people defeat the zombies, and not the other way around. Then he said this: the audience is against evil, basically, and I think that the Clint Eastwood films are much more harmful to the youth. My films are only nightmares, after which you wake up relieved and relaxed, and fantastic films are liberating, especially for the youth, because of this role of the audience. How would you like to respond? Is Fulci less harmful than Clint Eastwood?
Yeah, Fulci, like a lot of Clint Eastwood's critics, I think could benefit from maybe watching the films before he opens his fucking mouth. But no, I think he's onto something a little bit. I mean, I think there's potentially. I mean, I think he's maybe like giving the answer I think he thinks the journalists want to hear, because I think we see in Cat in the Brain, I think he's pretty against the idea that any sort of content is going to inspire people to go out and do violence. But I think he's maybe onto something a little bit, that like his fantastical dreamlike horror movies are a lot less relatable to an audience, a lot less like potentially actionable to an audience than something like a Dirty Harry movie, which takes place in a very recognizable world and features a character who you're supposed to sort of cheer along as they do things that even they know are horrific. I think he's both right and wrong, but I don't know. I want to give Fulci the benefit of the doubt there, and suggest that he's just kind of taking the bait with that answer.
So I just looked up Clint's filmography. 1980 was Bronco Billy, Any Which Way You Can. 1982 was Firefox and Honky Tonk Man.
Clint is in his most affable period.
I agree.
Fulci,
I think
open
he's
your eyes,
probably
man.
referring to Dirty Harry and, stuff like Outlaw Josie Wales, and High Plains Drifter, I assume, would probably be
High Plains Drifter,
one.
I think, in particular, yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to think about horror, though, is because so many people just say, like, oh, video games and horror films, like, people will see them and then go do the things they see. But hearing Fulci say, well, no, they're cheering for the good guys, is an interesting take, especially with this movie we're about to talk about. So Cat in the Brain, we've mentioned, is a 1990 film where Fulci plays a version of himself. And I thought it was funny because everyone I personally know who had seen this movie understood the concept, thought it was just a funny and farcical thing. But then I started looking it up online. It was pretty much universal hatred, or at least disdain towards it, that I could find. What is your take on this film's approach, and how do you feel its concept lands?
I'm with you, Craig. Everybody I follow on Letterboxd, like everyone I know personally who has seen the film, likes it, gets what it's doing, would rate it like highly amongst Fulci's other films. And then the general critical consensus for it is that it's one of his worst, that he totally missed it. And I love this movie. It's most obviously comparable to Wes Craven's New Nightmare. A director kind of playing themselves and wrestling with their body of work. I just think he nails it here. I think it's funny when it needs to be funny. It's gross when it needs to be gross. And it uses his kind of signature dreamlike logic in such an interesting way. Having like he himself get kind of like lost in like sequences out of his films is so interesting. It makes you kind of question your own eyes. And the ending is really funny. It has an ending that anyone who has seen Abbas Kiarostami's A Taste of Cherry or Jerry Lewis's The Patsy will recognize. And I think it's the best version of that ending of the three, frankly.
I'm gonna first have to just clear that thought that the ending is better than Taste of Cherry's ending is. Can't. No, I mean I thought it was a very charming movie. The ending definitely did catch me. Like I was like, oh, it like of course I was stupid enough and didn't realize what was coming. So I like that. I'm glad that you guys talked about the quote from Fulci before, because the kind of counterpoint that people would say to him, and I think this movie is him almost wrestling with that in a way, is, well, people would say, yeah, in horror movies you're kind of rooting for the people to defeat the zombie or the monster, kind of the evil thing. But so often in horror movies, that evil thing can be coded as other people. And yeah, it can be just as violent or destructive or kind of anti-human as, some of the more fascistic Clint Eastwood movies or whatever filmmaker you want to put in there. I think Fulci is kind of pulling back from that idea a little bit with this and kind of saying more, but the images are me. That's what the audiences are interacting with. It's a projection of myself and kind of what I'm working through. I'm not saying these are not coded messages for other people or other things, or kind of, there's not an ideology here or kind of consistent political worldview. It is me trying to communicate something about bodies, about the unknown, about in Cat in the Brain, about what a legacy is to have and what it means to have it exist as something independent of you as a person.
And I think as funny and as affable a movie as this is at times, it's also a lot like Wes Craven's New Nightmare and Scream 3, kind of a despairing movie. Pinkerton notes in that art forum piece that, we get these shots of Fulci like alone in this mansion by himself. There's really a sense that it's this kind of solitary existence. I know in real life, Fulci, he lost his wife to suicide and his daughter to like a car accident. So he was, in his personal life, potentially sort of a lonely guy. But I think there's a sense here, much like in those Craven films, that Fulci is saying like, well, this is what you want. Here it is. And there's an anger to that. I think the Dr. Egon Schwartz or whatever his name is, when he has that angry rant about like, oh, it's all about the stupid idea that violence in horror movies inspires violence. Like, I think Fulci is kind of bitter about two different things. I think he is bitter about the idea that everyone thinks he's this like creepy, gore guy, that like, this is really like all that's like spinning around in his head. And then I think he also resents the notion that everyone thinks that horror movies have this like deleterious social impact. I think he's saying with the film, like, if these horror movies have an impact, it's on me personally. It's on like my career. It's on your ability to take me seriously. And maybe, it's on my psyche potentially.
I do love it. There's a point where he mentions, I tried to do love stories, but no one bought tickets. So here I am making horror.
Right, because he worked in a lot of genres before making his first horror movie, right? I mean, he had been a fairly active director for a while, right? I've not seen any of the pre-horror movie ones. I think the earliest film of his I've seen might be Lizard in a Woman's Skin. But I know he had done kind of all sorts of genre stuff, including comedies.
So of the critiques I could find online, so many people just relate it to a lazy mid-series, TV clip show. The script apparently was just a series of essentially establishing shots that allowed clips from various films under the Lucio Fulci Presents banner to play. I mean, what do you think this film's greatest strengths and flaws are? Because it has some of both.
Its greatest flaw, which for me comes all the way back around to being a strength, is how kind of repetitive it is. I think a lot of the criticism of it online basically boils down to like, once you've seen him kind of have one of these weird fantasy nightmare dreams, you've seen them all. But I would say its greatest strength, even if it is like minor Fulci that it's interpolating, or like films that he only like stamped his name on that it's interpolating, a lot of those gore effects are really incredible. There's a sequence when he's microwaving some food and starts to imagine a face getting like melted by acid, and then he turns around and is going to pour himself a drink, and he drops a liquor bottle, and it's suddenly replaced by like a putrefacting corpse. And like, folks, nobody ever rotted a corpse like Lucio Fulci. I mean, it's really incredible stuff. I can't get not liking this movie. I don't know. I feel like I always say this when I'm on Split Picks. Like, if you don't like this movie, you don't like cinema. But folks, if you don't like Cat in the Brain, I'm not sure you like Lucio Fulci's movies.
Well, I think a lot of people were looking at it as a comparison to 8.5, which I don't really think is fair, because that's obviously has a much different intention.
What he's like setting out to do, right?
No, this one I think
he's not Alejandro Gonzalez Iñárritu making Bardo here, folks. This is not like, he's not setting out to make his 8.5. This is, a state of the union of Lucio Fulci. It's like his Inland Empire or something. It's like a state of the union of his psyche. But I think more of like a troll than even that. I really think, and this is not just me like looking for ways to talk about the movies I'm trying to write about, but I think of it as being a little bit like Scream 3. I mean, I really think of it as being like a movie that's about kind of like what it's like to be pigeonholed as a director. It's about everybody seeing you, and thinking that you're this, spooky guy. And what it's like to kind of like wear that reputation. As much as it's like a funny movie at times, it's also sort of like an angry and despairing one in that respect.
I mean, I think I have a natural kind of inoculation to, people who have the kind of knee-jerk critique of something like this, or Bardo, or 8.5, of like indulgent films, or films that are about directors who, talk about their work in different ways, and not to put this one in the same category as the others because I think it's not self-serious in the way that Bardo probably is going to be when that comes out.
But like hubris in and of itself is not a bad thing. You want a director who has a certain exactly. You want a director who has a certain amount of
that's what I love. Like, that's what I think is important about it. And it's like I would much rather have this kind of movie where, you know, you have someone who does have an understanding of what they believe is their kind of artistic signature, their kind of legacy, or what they understand is important to them about making movies. Whether or not other people agree with that or kind of see them in the same light, I think is sort of secondary. I just think this kind of, the conceit is always very interesting to me. And I kind of like the idea of being able to rewrite or re-express yourself in this kind of way. And it feels in a way more poignant because there's a way for horror to feel much more of like an intimate thing. It's a more intimate relationship when you're talking about, you know, having such a visceral reaction to something. I mean, that had to be designed. It had to be made. And, you know, Fulci is kind of overseeing, talking about, you know, the intimacy of what it means to make the practical effect, film it, and then for people to see it. You know, there's that, it's kind of a throwaway moment, but, you know, there's the scene with the eyes and, you know, saying the eyes don't look right, you know, when they're like bursting out of the person's head. And does it really have to look real? Because nothing that happens in the movies looks per se, in any of his movies, looks per se real. But does he think that it looks real? He can't possibly. So it just seems like a way for him. I mean, again, Bennett, this kind of goes back to what you were saying about his Clint Eastwood commentary, that there are moments in the film where he seems to be playing to what people would expect him to be like or work like. And then there are maybe other moments that for him felt more personally kind of edifying, or that he was, you know, working through something that was more interesting to him.
There's obviously like a great tradition in literature of writers having sort of like stand-ins and like exploring the biography of their stand-ins over like multiple novels. This makes me wish it was more of a thing in film. And maybe it is, and I'm like forgetting examples, but I don't know. I wish there were more movies like this. I wish there were more examples of like directors playing themselves, and I wish Lucio Fulci had played Dr. Fulci over like a range of films, because this is obviously him, you know, playing a guy late into his career. I would have liked to have seen, you know, some young Fulci type films.
Yeah.
He does appear in a lot of his movies in little, you know,
I think he has
Hitchcockian
like
cameos.
Stuff,
yeah. Mm-hmm. So, Frankie, I think it's interesting you mentioned the reality of the images and how believable they are. Because watching this last night, it made me think about, Bennett, you wrote about Georges Franju's Blood of the Beasts from 1949, and that is a movie about touring a abattoir in France. It's gross. Talk about realistic horror. That's a lot going on there. But the scene that made me think of Blood of the Beast is when he goes to lunch and the waiter's like, "Oh, would you like a steak today?" And he's like, no steak today. Well, what about a steak tartare? And it's just the raw meat on the plate. And he's like, "No, I can't do it." And he has to like run out of the restaurant. I mean, I think horror films have filled the repulsive duties when they can make you not want to eat or like have something like that. And I don't know, do you see any similarities between how the intersection of like when the images are too real versus fake, like when you see a horror image and you can't eat because of it? Like, do you feel Fulci does that, or is that something that like would come from having to think of these just continually disturbing things constantly?
I think that's a wonderful sequence. His sort of nightmarish daydream there, and I think Fulci has definitely concocted images that have like nauseated me, like what few other directors have put up there. I would say precisely because they seem kind of unreal. As much as like Blood of the Beast turns my stomach, and as much as that kind of tries to create sort of an otherworldly appearance with all the fog and steam and stuff, Fulci's like the crazy colors when a face is melting with acid and stuff, that's like nothing else. And you can see how directing that and like living in that world all the time, you could believe that you would wind up like the Fulci of this film for sure.
I mean, I will say, as someone who really does love horror movies, I can't eat after watching many of them. But certainly Fulci's, just because, if for nothing else, so many of the things that happen to bodies, like it's a recurring thing for people's throats to get ripped out or their tongues to get cut out or ripped out in some form, and just that idea. I mean, it seems like it's a particular concern for Fulci is, I'm thinking especially of the throat or the tongue, not being able to articulate yourself in kind of that moment of horror and kind of extreme trauma. That is something that is terrifying for him.
Yeah.
And kind of grotesque for everybody. And I think that is also, in a different way, part of what the film is trying to work through, from him looking at himself, is what is it, Bennett, as you were saying, his personal issues, losing his family. That's a different kind of horror. That's a different kind of trauma to process. But the question of how you express that, or how you understand it through being able to talk about it or express it or hold on to a piece of yourself in kind of these moments of pain, is obviously a concern for him.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the throats getting like bitten out or tongues getting ripped out, because that for me is like it's not so much a recurring nightmare as like a recurring factor of nightmares. I find anytime I'm in like a nightmare scenario, that's a big part of it, is that I'm trying to talk and I can't do it, and I feel like Fulci like gets that and really taps into it. I'm particularly disgusted by like rot, like that made up phobia where people can't look at beehives. Like I think I have it because that I don't know, it gets me, and I Fulci really just makes a meal out of that sort of imagery. He can really, I've said it a few times, he can really melt a corpse.
Another thing I love about this movie is, my brother and I watched it last night, and he pointed out the connection that it kind of feels like a Charlie Brown movie. I mean, you could kind of compare it to Charlie Brown Christmas, or he's kind of wandering around just like, what's the meaning of horror films these days, And then he's just haunted by everything he sees. How do you feel about Fulci's acting chops? Because he is the star of this movie, and it's just, he's living in his own world and being just tormented by it.
I think he does a capable job, and I think it's it fits his films that he's not very over-the-top emotional. He doesn't get like big monologues or anything that I remember, and we talked about before, like in his films, people tend to be remarkably straight-faced as they're being like ripped apart, and I don't know, he has this kind of mopey Charlie Brown like vibe as he's walking through it. And we talked about too the despairing tone. I like his performance. Yeah, again, I wish he had led more of his films. I think more directors should do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has this nice kind of very understated quality. It's not really like, they're not dialogue heavy, or like the story or dialogue. That's not what you're really watching them for, nor should you really for any horror movie, or most movies in general should you be watching them for those things. Although the movie is about him, there's a way in which, Bennett, if he had like a long monologue where he was like, decrying, this or that, there's a way that would take away from the movies themselves and the work itself, and kind of be more about him as a figure and a persona. And I think he might be interested in himself internally, in himself as a figure and his relationship to this, but I feel like he's very careful to not give himself any big kind of grandstanding moment, because he's more interested about the imagery.
So in the grand scheme of things, this movie is about the artistic struggle. And it was funny watching this last night because, Bennett, we just recorded with Steve Collins, who's written a bunch about putting the artistic process on film. This is one I think he definitely needs to look at, because he's just going around, and anytime he's tormented, he's trying to figure out, like, how could this be used in a film? And, like, there's the part where he's just imagining the Nazi orgy, and he, like, passes out during an interview, and he's like, what happened? But it does bring up the question of, how do you keep finding ways to be repulsive and also preserve your sanity?
As he shows here, not easily. I think the sequence with the Nazi orgy is incredible, and I like that, like, so much is left unseen in this movie. When he comes to from that sequence, we find out that like what's really been happening has been just as nuts as that Nazi orgy. He like beat up a cameraman or something. I like to, we mentioned his doctor is killing people and hoping to frame him. When his doctor is apprehended, finally, that happens off screen. We just learn that they found him through like following Fulci. So I like that he's like, it's very much about this like personal narrative. He is kind of disinterested in a lot of like the usual plot elements and leaves those kind of off to the side in favor of this kind of intense psychological personal narrative.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I had not really thought of it that way, but I think it's true. He does kind of, he's not presenting the kind of overcoming of evil in any serious or satisfying way, and it's not even true in his movies that that's always what you see happen. So yeah, I think it's the idea of leaving things out and kind of saying out, well, forget about that. It's a very kind of Fulci technique that we've talked about. Of it's a common thing for him to bring up things, or characters will reference things, or sometimes things will get acknowledged and they just have no bearing on the plot whatsoever. Because ultimately, he's not terribly concerned with, the plot. As Bennett said before, it's more of an image thing than it is like a plot or a series of sequences that kind of wrap around together.
Yeah, and I think it does, it just kind of messes with audience expectations. Like, one of the things I read was like, well, it's not a traditional giallo because the killer's identity isn't a secret, which leaves no space for a reveal. It's like, who cares?
I kind of like that, though.
Yeah.
I like that the kills are sort of like the reversal of what we're used to seeing in a giallo. Instead of like seeing his hands, we're like looking at his face. It feels like something out of like a regional horror movie. And yeah, I don't know. Why does that make it a bad thing that it's not a
I don't think it
giallo,
does.
folks? Come on.
It's a different approach, It's like it could just be the same thing. I mean, I think they just wanted it to end with Fulci actually being the killer. Like, that's the only way I can take that. Like, oh, well, I was expecting a twist. Who cares?
I kind of I like to sort of like return to the notion that he's like a Charlie Brown like figure for a second. He's so put upon. Like, everyone here like is kind of like giving him shit constantly. His doctor's assistant calls him a little shit at one point, which is such a weird thing to call an adult man. Not you little shit. I don't know. It's funny too that like, so the movie rejects one kind of pop psychology idea that like violent movies inspire violence, but also the guy is like, I can't believe you're seeing a psychiatrist. Like, it very much supports the idea that like psychiatry is nutty, which I think is sort of I don't know, in keeping with this sort of weird, confused politics sort of inherent to the genre. And I don't know, we get a lot of sequences of his psychiatrist like explaining things, which are always good for exploitation movies. You always know you're in good hands when a psychiatrist is sort of explaining the notion of a character's mania.
I just love how his wife always has a bowl of candy in bed. That's just a great touch. Now, one thing, whenever Jim Hickox is on the show, he always talks about how you have to get in the film's wavelength or in the film's mindset. And I feel like this is one where if you're fighting the current, you're not going to enjoy it because you're just going to want your own things out of it. Do you feel that's fair?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Like most of the movies I've covered on the show, you're in for a long sit if you're not vibing with the movie after like 5 minutes. I think if the first fake out annoys you more than it thrills you, oh, buddy. First of all, you need to ask yourself if you like cinema. Second of all, you might want to turn off A Cat in the Brain. I think basically you know what you're in for as soon as you get the shot of the cat attacking a brain.
Oh, yeah.
In the opening couple of minutes. Question for you both. I mean, do you see this film being of interest to someone who doesn't have any familiarity with Fulci's other work?
I wouldn't think so. I think you kind of have to know who and what Fulci is to appreciate this one. I mean, obviously some people might just get a kick out of it, like, oh, this is goofy, but I don't know. It might be a tough one to find something to latch on to if you go in cold. So
yeah, I would sort of agree with that. I think any of his movies, though, can be kind of a hard sell for some people who are depending on how much they like this type of, his genre of filmmaking or, what we would generally call his style. I think everything could be a hard sell. But in a way, he feels at his most kind of relatable in this sense. And I think if you almost came at one of his other films with the perspective of, oh, well, it's not just like, he actually does think about these images. It's not just, I mean, I hate this classification, but it's not just gratuitous violence or something like that. There is something that personally he's invested in. Maybe for, I think, those audiences who are maybe a little more off-put by violence, this could be a way to ease them in and kind of work backwards.
I think all you really need to know to get something out of it, and again, this is maybe just a testament to the fact that the film is very much up my alley. It's sort of like meta bullshit, but I think as long as you know he's a director playing himself, you sort of get the point. But I do think it is a film that is naturally going to be more appealing to people who are really like Fulci heads. I mean, I even feel like I don't know that I got necessarily the references or anything, or if there are specific references to like earlier films of his. To me, it's just like, I like hanging out with the director as themselves. I like the sort of, I like a director subjecting themselves to their own like dream logic. It's like the experience that he's given audiences of watching his films. It's like forcing himself, not just to be a character in one of his films, but to like have the experience of watching them. And I feel like that's not something a lot of directors have done. I mean, Wes Craven, I keep belaboring that, but he's really the only one that comes to mind as like someone who's, put himself as a character in his own series. I mean, I don't know, like Stephen King does it with like the Dark Tower books, but I can't really think of another film series where that's the case.
So I think my last question for this movie is, what do you think Fulci is saying about the genre of horror as a whole?
I think he's saying it has a lot of potential for a lot of things, but I think he's saying that ultimately getting stuck in a position where that's all anyone's expecting of you and it's all that you can make of your life is ultimately pretty unfulfilling and even like horrific. Again, I think like, yeah, as goofy as this film is, the poster is so off the wall and like colorful. I think it's ultimately like a pretty despairing film. I think Fulci is ultimately suggesting, while horror is potentially fodder for great art, yeah, it's not maybe something that he's glad he's found his way. It's not something he's glad to be stuck in.
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of, Hanukkah anti-cinema approach to some elements of Fulci there. And I think also, one thing that I'm struck by with this film, and to different degrees might apply to others, I think Fulci is if you're going to make a movie like this about, yourself and kind of your relationship to your other movies and kind of what people under the public perception of you or kind of your relationship to audiences, it does emphasize something that is important to horror cinema that I think a lot of us know, which is that horror movies are so much about the community of like fans or people who appreciate the genre in different ways, and we all have our favorites and kind of appreciate things that others don't about certain films or kind of those filmmakers. And although the movie itself is not really invested in the community per se, other than his kind of spare interactions with individuals in his life, it is a movie that can only really be made if you feel that a bedrock understanding of, what we're all getting into when we get into a horror movie and what we all kind of want to take out of it. And as despairing as it is in a lot of the ways that Bennett points out to, I think it also has a kind of faith in people, or kind of like a trust in other people, that we're all on the same page, basically. We're all coming at this genre, or writ large, from different angles, but we're all like seeking the same things out of it.
I think maybe I wouldn't go so far as to call it despairing, because I think that ending says a lot. At the end of the day, like, as much as he wishes he'd gotten to make other kinds of films, or that he wasn't just a horror guy, horror bought him a boat. Like a boat that he calls Perversion.
Such a good touch.
Yeah, it's so funny.
So I just checked. According to Wikipedia, he's directed 48 films. This was 47 of 48, so essentially his second to last full film. I think there were a few others he was working on, but he got sick and couldn't complete them, from my understanding. I could be totally wrong. But this, to me, is a great late/end-of-career film, because it's taking a look at your entire life's work and wrestling with what it all means. I don't know too many people who have done that convincingly.
Yeah, and it's a perfect send-off, too. At the end of the film, he's headed off to vacation, to compare him to Clint. If Clint goes out on Cry Macho, Clint goes out dancing. I'd like to think of Fulci as, going out on vacation on Perversion, the SS Perversion.
It might be good just to wrap it up with, how do you feel about Fulci, his standing in the horror world as a whole? I mean, do you think he's an all-timer? Is he an important figure? Where do you feel he lands among the genre?
I mean, as someone who really did more of a speed run through Fulci since August, it's been very enjoyable to kind of become familiar with a director who is, in ways that we touched on before, so interested in this in a way that's somewhat reminiscent of other directors in the genre, or certainly someone like Hitchcock, interested in people being thrust in these kinds of situations, forced to interact with characters, forced to deal with kind of events that are outside their comprehension in a kind of Lovecraftian way, and to not really be able to do anything about it. I think his movies, what's striking to me is that so often in his movies, certainly in the Gates of Hell trilogy, you just don't have the logic of a horror movie that he talks about, of defeating the thing. It's just not there. The question I think that he raises for some of the movies is, if you can't get that heroic moment, what else can you get out of it? Or, what kind of fruit can be born from interacting with kind of the unknown, or kind of the evil, or, monstrous figures? And I think from one movie to the next, that answer kind of changes, and it looks different for different characters, and even Fulci himself. But for all of the, perverse, disgusting, spectacular elements of Fulci, I think there is an element of like a humanist in there, and there is like an interest in what people are that people shouldn't kind of ignore or kind of gloss over too much.
Yeah, I think obviously his reputation is not as sterling as Mario Bava or Dario Argento. Argento just got a full career retrospective at the Film Society of Lincoln Center, and it's hard to imagine Fulci getting the same treatment. That said, speed running both of their filmographies the last couple of months. Fulci deserves a place in the annals of the genre for sure. He is really basically peerless when it comes to some of the imagery he's able to come up with, and some of the kind of dreamlike atmosphere he's able to conjure up. And I don't think you come up with images of terror and grotesquerie like he does without some interest in like the emotions underlying the suffering. I don't think you show the body experiencing such trauma without some interest in human suffering, some sort of deeper interest. I think he's a smarter filmmaker than he gets credit for, like a lot of the filmmakers we discuss in the show. I think
I'd agree with that. I think he's worth at least knowing the basics of. I haven't gone super deep yet, but there's still a few I'd love to see. But he is so good at just doing out of this world images, and like we talked about, where it's just people standing around looking at these terrible things like, oh, this is bad. Like, I think that's how most of us would probably react, just like, oh God, what do I respond, do? Right? My mom's face is melting. What do I do now? It's just like there's no answer to that. Well, Bennett, Frankie, I think we'll cut it there. We cover a lot of ground today, so thank you both for joining us. Bennett, do you want to tease who we'll be talking about in next week's episode?
Yes. An Italian director who doesn't get discussed even as much as Fulci. Kind of the maybe forgotten giallo Italian genre director, Sergio Martino.
We're going to be joined by Jim Hickox for that one. Bennett, we'll see you next week. Frankie, we'll see you soon. Happy October.